Okay, awesome. Thank you all. Thank you for waiting a few extra moments. Some tech challenges, always fun. I think it's a good reminder for this session in terms of bringing smallholder farmers' voice to the conversation, that if we're having technological challenges here, that these are things that happen in the field as well. I know there's people joining online, but I just wanted to get a sense of who is in the room, and there are not a ton of us. So I just wanted to kind of go around and have everyone to share who they are, what brought you here today, organization you're working with, because I'll talk for about 20 minutes, but then I do want to have kind of a discussion and opportunity to talk and share with everybody here. I can start. I'm Katie Messick. I'm here with Producers Direct. I am a COO and I've been there for about 10 years and excited to share some more information shortly. But yes.
I'm Jean-Pierre Lavelle and I'm from AgriLedger. And what we've done is we've built a technical solution using blockchain technology. And now this is real. And we looked at the whole ecosystem. This is now about taking it a step back and really making sure the community is getting what it needs and requires.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Jonathan Schofield, I'm from Catholic Relief Services. I'm a technical advisor for our Ag and Livelihoods programming team, and I focus on knowledge management and learning and scaling of our capacity strengthening.
Awesome.
Cool. Oh, I'm Lena. I'm just assistant. You can skip me.
Everybody's important.
That's important.
It's very important. Yes.
I'm Colby Silver. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in our agricultural and extension education program. But I have done a lot of work internationally. I was based in West Africa for 2 years as a project coordinator with World Fish on a smallholder aquaculture, but a big gender component in nutrition part of that project too. So I kind of bring international and US extension into it.
Great.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Creed. I work at World Food Program USA, which is a nonprofit that serves the goals of the UN World Food Program. I work in corporate partnerships there. I'm new, I'm 1 month in, and I used to be at DAI working on digital development.
Oh, cool.
So both worlds here.
Awesome.
I'm Ian Pringle and I am with Farm Radio International. So when I saw the title of this session, I thought, well, I really have to be here to hear this. Just that whole idea very much appeals to me, and it's often forgotten.
Yes.
I think, or not necessarily forgotten, but neglected or whatever. So very happy to be here.
Yes, awesome. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining the session today. And I think, yes, when we get into the tech space and the digital space, the smallholder voice or the end user voice can really easily be forgotten. And I think we've seen that even in some of the sessions today of how, tech can move so fast, but we're working with people on the other side, and we're working with smallholders in really rural, remote areas with limited technological access, right? So how can we make things work better? So I just put up a few questions. I tried to think of just, or kind of have just 3, but there's 6 here. So just put these up for everybody just to take a look at briefly. Because as I said, I do want to kind of have a discussion and an opportunity for all of us to chat and learn from one another at the end. So just looking at failures, successes, and lessons learned using human-centered design, leveraging and adapting existing tech in rural communities. So the use case I'll talk about today is doing exactly that. How can we kind of bring technology that does already exist and adapt it to local contexts? And then the question, can tech or artificial intelligence solve problems facing smallholders? And then how can we encourage donors to allow for more flexibility in ICTforAg? I think this is something that we touched on a bit this morning, but there's a lot of priorities coming out of the donor landscape and the donor space and expectations. And how do we pair and match that with realities on the ground if we need to adapt, or if the technological solution no longer makes sense, but the donor is saying, no, but you have to do it, you have to do it. I think looking a bit at better engaging end users and co-creating these solutions, and then prioritizing less extractive data practices. So I think any of us working in this space know that we are taking tons of data and information out of rural communities, but how can we have these kind of loops go back into the communities to benefit the smallholder farmers? So these are things that we can look at the end. So as I said, I'll be talking about a really specific use case today, but just big picture. I work with Producers Direct. Our kind of tagline is by farmers for farmers, and that is kind of really central and core to who we are. We've been around for about 15 years. We are headquartered in the UK with offices in East Africa, in Uganda, and in Nairobi, and in Latin America and Peru. I am the only person based in the States, so I work out of my home, so it's all very remote and digital. So we work directly with producer organizations and smallholder farmers. The majority of our board is comprised of smallholder producers. And our kind of sole owner as an entity, as a charity, is a network of 280,000 smallholder farmers. So they have a lot of influence on what we're doing and how we're doing it. And we are really kind of prioritizing their voice and vision in everything that we're doing. So kind of our big picture idea goal is inspiring these smallholder farmers from around the world to join forces and to connect with one another and to together increase their resilience, incomes, and livelihoods. So we work across 3 priority areas. And today we'll obviously be focusing on the kind of data for decision-making piece. But the other areas where we're working are amplifying collective power. So really recognizing and leveraging all of the innovations and solutions coming out of smallholder communities, and how can we kind of scale these out. Empowering smallholders with data, and this is to strengthen decision-making, and that's what I'll be talking about mostly today, and digitizing market access. So we've also developed and deployed a mobile marketplace that links smallholders directly to markets. I was speaking to someone earlier, this is definitely a really challenging space to work in if we're actually working with smallholders. I think a lot of people have kind of mobile marketplaces, but they're not actually working with smallholders in really rural, remote areas. It's hard to do. So with that, we'll get into the use case today that I'll be looking at, which is Croppie. So what is Croppie? I'll try to make this simple and brief, as someone said earlier, explaining it to, was it their aunt, their mother? Was it you that said that earlier?
That was
Somebody in your panel. Andrew, okay. So Croppie, very simply, is AI powered. But it is a way to generate yield predictions on a smallholder's farm. So we had the gentleman from Syngenta talking about this earlier, but I think that was much more used kind of in the States. So what we've built is kind of the capacity to use a smartphone, if you have a smartphone, to take multiple photographs of coffee cherries on your coffee tree, coffee bush at a certain point in the season. And then immediately this will generate an AI generated yield prediction, along with tailored agronomic and financial tips. So it's really kind of testing, is this possible? Is this feasible to work for smallholder farmers? So on the left in the picture here is just showing kind of what the AI does. It's the same kind of technology for facial recognition. So we've trained the algorithm to identify the coffee cherries, and that's what all those little boxes are on the cherries on the tree. And we've done this using data and information directly from smallholder farmers. So there's a lot of conversations in the AI space about, how smallholders aren't engaged, their information isn't used, and they're kind of marginalized from all these processes. We're actually working with smallholders to build and train this algorithm. There's some obvious massive challenges and failures. As you can see right here, I have a smartphone on the right-hand side. Does this actually work, and is it relevant in contexts where smallholder farmers are living and working on their farms? Definitely not always, right? We are seeing more and more farmers that are using and accessing smartphones, but the reality that I'll get to later is most are really comfortable with feature phones, and if they have a smartphone, they're really mostly comfortable using WhatsApp. So I can share a bit more of what we've done to overcome that as well. But this big picture is what we'll be looking at today. Let's see. Oh, it did jump. Okay. So again, as everybody has also been talking about today, partnerships are really, really important. And we know at Producers Direct, we're a very small organization that we cannot do all of this alone. And that we really require partners in the space to do this. So we've been working with CIAT, experts in big data, climate science. We've been working with IDEO.org, who's really helped us with human-centered design and our approaches and reaching smallholders and ensuring that what we build is fit for purpose. And then we're working with 10 producer organizations across both East Africa and Latin America. And then local partners in both Colombia and Uganda that are really helping us kind of reach even more farmers. And as I said at the start, we work with a network of about 37 producer organizations globally. So have that kind of background with us, representing the 1 million smallholders that we have reached. So these are just kind of some of the photographs of everybody we've been working with, the logos from the various organizations, but this is really a collective group effort and not something that we are trying to do on our own. So the big challenge that we're looking at, and I think that we've been talking a lot about today, is the importance of kind of data for decision making, right? And that we all know that smallholders do not have access to the actionable real-time data they need to make decisions on their farms. And when we're looking at climate change, we recognize how critical and important this is. We are all really data-driven, and if we step back and think about all the different things that we're doing each day, whether it's I get a notification from my Fitbit to tell me to get up and move around. But if you think about a farmer on a farm in a rural context that does not have that kind of information, it's nearly impossible to make informed and smart decisions about how you're farming. And as we know, kind of this power of big data, AI, all these things are just not reaching smallholders. So how can we actually do that? And we also know that we need really, really large volumes of ground truth data to make this work and make it accessible for farmers. And that just doesn't exist right now. So I think this is probably obvious for everybody in the room, but why doesn't this data exist? It's far too expensive to collect data at scale, especially in rural and remote areas. Data that is collected is not standardized. I think some people have been talking about this today. We have all of this data, but it's not standardized. It doesn't speak to each other, and it never kind of gets fed back to farmers themselves. It's often not available in real time, and AI is typically not designed in partnership with farmers. So our hypothesis, very specific to Croppie, is that AI-generated yield predictions could offer smallholder farmers valuable insights and information on how to plan their farms, strengthen their resilience, and make their farms more successful and sustainable for kind of themselves and their families and their communities, right? So looking at, is this actually feasible to do? Can we do this? Can we design something in partnership with farmers and also benefit farmers themselves? So the next few slides I'll go through is kind of our co-design process, very much inspired by the work of IDEO.org, who really helped us throughout this process, and kind of looks at how we have always operated as an organization since we were founded in 2009. So the kind of 4 areas that we'll look at are trust, inspiration, co-creation, and implementation. So in terms of trust, this is built on deep relationships with smallholders. And I think this is a really big kind of priority area. If you're going to introduce a kind of a new digital tool, you need to have trust from the farmers, especially if we're going to then trust that data, that information. And particularly if you're going to look for behavior change on the ground, this needs to come from a trusted entity, or there's no way that it's going to work. You'll have a farmer that might receive some kind of information and say, thanks, that's great, but there's no way I'm going to do anything with this. So inspiration, this is really looking at the fact that solutions have to be rooted in the realities facing smallholders, right? Somebody earlier said something about once you deploy the solution, and I was thinking, it's like, once you deploy the solution, you need to have that solution co-created with the farmers. If you're creating that tech, if you're creating that solution outside of that reality, it's never going to work. It might be really fancy, it might be incredible, it might be shiny, you might get all the funds in the world. But will it be adapted on the ground? Will it be used by a farmer? And will it catalyze behavior change? Probably not. So I think it is figuring out, how do we slow down and how do we have that inspiration from where we're working? And then co-creation. So this is that kind of prototyping process, is continuous testing, iterating, learning, celebrating those failures, moving forward. And then implementation and ensuring that that's really kind of farmer-led. And that, farmers are bought in terms of the business model, in terms of the partnerships you're bringing on. So we'll go into all these in a bit more detail. So trust, as I said, we've been investing in smallholder farmers for 15 years, and having smallholder farmers on our board keeps us honest, ensures that what we're doing is really rooted in local communities. And we work through producer organizations. So we're working really closely with smallholder farmers themselves, but also the agricultural extension workers, and kind of youth agents in the area that we employ to support us in kind of scaling out. And so we're a very kind of trusted organization locally where we're working. And we're really committed to using this powerful voice of kind of all the smallholders we're working with to tackle global challenges. And something that's really important, what we're doing is kind of blending that wisdom, the local wisdom, with these pioneering kind of technological tools, right? And the other kind of thing just to touch on is the importance of not, what we're doing is not just digital. We have a really large in-person presence as well. That digital can't do it all, that you have to be able to kind of be there in person as well. So going on to inspiration. This is an image we use a lot at work to just kind of ground ourselves and remind ourselves where we are, when you can kind of get carried away in all the technology and the AI and all these solutions. But kind of just imagining where the farmers are that we're ultimately hoping to have an impact on, where they're living, right? And again, another reminder, this is the technology that you have in your hands. If you have a smartphone, you're probably not really comfortable using it. You're not about to, necessarily download a new app and know how to kind of use that app. So again, just another kind of grounding in terms of the inspiration. And this is how you record your farm records. So this is the kind of information you have to hand. You might be aware of kind of last year's yields, have a sense of what things sold for, but you don't have kind of any dynamic data dashboards and all these things that we talk about. This is kind of really the reality. So when we were designing Croppie, we were doing this just right at the start of the pandemic. So a lot of our user research at the time was done remotely and virtually. So holding specific sessions kind of with smallholders, but specifically with young people, young men, young women, to kind of get an understanding of would this be feasible? What are farmers' thoughts? And just to say clearly that this was built on then kind of prior conversations about what farmers needed in terms of yield predictions, in terms of more kind of advisory services and things. But these are just some of the sessions that we did early on, so about 3 years ago at the start of the pandemic. And then into kind of co-creation. One of the first things that we were looking at and wanted to test and validate was that we could incentivize kind of smallholders to share data and information if there were kind of rewards at the end. So we used tools that we knew smallholders were comfortable using. And at this point, we're really looking at younger farmers, young men and young women that are using WhatsApp a lot, that are using Facebook, that are online a bit more. Can we incentivize them to start to take photographs of coffee cherries? Is this something that would even happen? So if we're thinking of building kind of a big AI model that can identify coffee cherries, you obviously need a lot of data to train those models. So these were some things that we were testing to see if we could incentivize this happening, having kind of leaderboards, having different rewards, different badges and banners and things, if, for sharing however many photos that you could get people to share. And this was definitely an uphill battle, right? Could we actually get somebody to be excited about taking all these pictures while simultaneously starting to test the kind of protocols that we were looking at to get the right photographs of the cherry? Because that sounds quite simple to do, but to actually get good quality photographs to train AI is just really, really challenging. So this was early on in kind of the co-creation process. And then this was a bit more of the in-person kind of co-creation. So these are photographs from Peru. And what we were looking at here is kind of the user interface and screen flows. So a big focus was like, okay, we're going to build this model. We are going to then generate an AI yield prediction. And then the farmer is going to access this how, right? And we're looking at kind of dashboards and things and what makes sense to a farmer, looking at kind of local languages, digital literacy, but also just kind of basic literacy. If we have really complicated graphs showing the potential yield, financial tips, agronomic tips, even in our testing, you can see the farmer's eyes just glazing over like, okay, they're back talking about something kind of crazy again. So we had a lot of different kind of screen flows and tests in terms of, does this work or this work? Does this or this? Would you prefer to have kind of some video and voiceover? Is it just images? How does this work that you're actually receiving something that makes sense? So we spent months and months kind of doing this, testing this, which of course can be problematic for partners and donors, right? That want things fast, fast, fast. So we're looking as well at on-farm data collection. A lot of the data was collected before we had the app through Kovo, which was the gentleman who presented this morning. I forget the name of the kind of his umbrella organization, the main organization, but we use Kovo Toolbox, which is amazing because it works offline. So you can collect data information, not connect it, and then kind of upload it later. So we were also testing what was, kind of digital literacy. How comfortable were farmers receiving information? At this point, we had tested sending out some SMS messages, which have really different results from East Africa and Latin America. In East Africa, kind of the SMSs were received. It was great. Yes, I got it. Didn't really know what to do with it, but I received it. In Peru, we found SMS is hardly ever used. It's mostly WhatsApp. And we would kind of have to grab, take someone's phone and be like, oh, the message is here. And it's like 500 unread messages. They're like, oh, yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. So like really kind of figuring out how to make this work. So this is just some images in Uganda. So we started kind of the testing and rollout in Peru and Colombia. And then when we had additional funding, we started to test and roll out things in Uganda. These are all places where we have partnerships that we've been working with the producer organizations and the group of farmers for a really long time. So what we were really focused on in Uganda was refining the kind of photo taking protocols. So as I said earlier, getting the photographs right to train the AI models was a very big challenge for us. So you can see here in the background, we have kind of the white bags, what white paper we put behind, because it was really hard for the AI to kind of identify the cherries. You can see kind of in this picture here, everything's green, right? The thought being, obviously if you've got bright red cherries and stuff, but at that point, it's not as useful. So really looking at, is this actually feasible to do, to expect that farmers are going to do this? And I should also share that in Latin America, and I think parts of Africa, the kind of yield predictions and kind of identifying what the potential yield might be are done, but it's a very kind of long, hard analog process where an extension officer would go out and do a lot of counting and things. This was never done really for smallholders themselves, where they typically wouldn't have their yield. So this is an opportunity for smallholders to have the yields, but also to automate the process and to save time, to save money. So that is what's going on here. So again, just kind of summing up, what was our goal? To build this prototype, to build an app, to see if this kind of technology could actually bring value to smallholders we work with. We wanted to see how smallholders engaged with what we were building and learn how to serve them even better. And I think one of the obvious big initial learnings was the smartphone application is not the best solution. So here is the kind of current user journey. And then I can get on in a few slides to kind of what the future vision is. So how it works very simply is a farmer will upload photos of their coffee plants into the Croppie app. That's the kind of best case scenario. Typically, a youth agent is on the farm supporting farmers to do this with their smartphone. And in other cases, the images are just uploaded into Kovo apart from the app, and they can be taken with a non-smartphone at that point. Then Croppie's AI recognizes and counts the coffee cherries on the image, and then data is generated to produce a yield prediction. So that kind of step 2 and 3 works really well. The AI training and that algorithm kind of has worked beautifully in some ways. And then Croppie provides this data information back to farmers. During that process of the kind of data collection and the photographs, farmers are sharing a bit more information about where they live, the size of their farm, how often they fertilize, their elevation, some other information, which is then used to provide these more tailored agronomic and financial tips. So it's not kind of basic information or super top down, it's kind of a bit more tailored and things. With a goal that then farmers are receiving this information and are connected to other farmers who might be facing similar challenges to kind of share knowledge with one another. So where are we in this kind of whole process thus far? So we've co-designed this tool with 2,660 smallholders from Peru, Colombia, and Uganda, the majority being in Latin America. We're still kind of doing this process right now as we speak in Uganda. Smallholders thus far have shared over 1 million data points to train the yield prediction model. So that's pretty incredible. This is everything from kind of where their farm is, GPS location, to tons and tons of images of coffee cherries. The AI generated yield estimates are 90% accurate. And so that has been really incredible. And this is compared to the manual counts that happen typically from extension workers. And then we're also collecting end of season actual yield data. So we're just now getting into our 3rd season. So that side of things is going well. It's really figuring out how do we make this useful for the farmers we're working with. And then based on some kind of survey data that we did in both Peru and Colombia a few months ago, 75% of the smallholders reported increased confidence to mitigate climate shocks, and 90% of the female farmers reported increased confidence using digital tools. And that's a result of working really closely with extension officers, with young people, to kind of figure out how to use their phones, to access a smartphone, whatever it might be. It's just an image of one of the female farmers we work with in Peru, who's just, talking about how great it is to have this, and to not have to do it manually. Often the kind of extension officers might show up and figure out what the count might be in the yield prediction, but then leave before sharing this information with the farmer. So it's really helpful, particularly when paired with these kind of tailored tips. So what were the learnings? I could spend hours just on the learnings, but just kind of tried to simplify it to these 5 kind of key learnings, which I'm guessing will resonate with most people. As I've said, the smartphone access. Farmers prefer to use their feature phones, as I've said, SMS, WhatsApp, Facebook, things like this. The idea of a farmer having a smartphone and being willing to then download a new application, paying for the data that it takes to do that, and then actually using that it's just too much, right? I think we're all I can be tech resistant sometimes with a new app. I want to use what I'm comfortable using. So we're figuring out how can we make this work better for farmers in their context and reality. Low literacy and low digital skills as well, especially for older farmers and female farmers. In a household, one person might have a smartphone or a feature phone. It's not that everybody necessarily has one and is comfortable using them. So how do we meet kind of everybody where they are? Particularly with kind of local languages and stuff. And this has become an even bigger issue in Uganda, where there's, many, many local languages. In Peru, Colombia, things are a bit easier. It's all Spanish, but English does not really work in rural contexts in Uganda. Something I touched on earlier in terms of kind of some of the questions we'll look at, flexibility. We know how important it is to be flexible and agile and building these tools. I think this is something that donors and some partners don't always appreciate. And so whatever you put into your initial funding proposal is what you must stick to. Even if the proposal was written 5 or 6 years ago and no longer makes sense for the context, there are donors that will say, no, carry on that path. And there's some great, more flexible donors that allow changes and allow for these things. But I think it is an important conversation to have of how do we talk more with donors about integrating some of this flexibility, this agility, if we're going to be prototyping and testing. I think with this big push for localization, which is incredible, donors need to adapt too, right? They need to understand, okay, if we're going to embrace this and work in these local contexts, things are going to change and we need to allow for that. Tailored agronomic tips. Really what we've heard back from farmers here is that the tips need to be even more personalized, even more tailored, and they need to have even more context and information to actually inspire change. So it's kind of like, thank you, that's a great tip, but I'm not going to necessarily do anything with it. We've had a few farmers that have said that's great. It was a good reminder in terms of watering or fertilizing, but I'm not going to really be changing my behavior dramatically based on a tip that I got. And with that is the peer-to-peer validation, is that we all know that farmers trust farmers best, right? So how do we integrate that kind of knowledge sharing from farmers? And how do we bring back in the in-person as well, right? How do we have that kind of in-person support, those in-person conversations happening alongside the digital? Because that can really build something much, much stronger. So I will now share kind of where our visioning is for Croppie going forward based on all these kind of learnings. So this is the new kind of proposed farmer journey. So the idea being that a farmer can ask a question, kind of any kind of question. When should I be fertilizing? What kind of fertilizer should I use? And this is where AI comes into things. AI finds the best answer available on our platform. So this is based on kind of farmer information and also science-led advisory. So we're not starting from scratch on this. We're talking to a lot of partners on how do we collect and aggregate all this data so it can be shared better with farmers. Producers Direct was also the founder of Wefarm, which some of you may have heard of, a kind of SMS-based platform where farmers are asking questions, getting answers from fellow farmers. We spun that off several years ago and then reacquired Wefarm about a year ago. Yes, yeah. So we have a database of about 25 million questions and answers from farmers that we've started to analyze and look at what kinds of questions are farmers asking, what kind of answers are available. So how do we integrate this with kind of more climate science, expert information? So the idea then is that AI can identify the best kind of follow-up question as well as an answer to give to the farmer to start to build a unique profile of the farmer. So I know if you're asking this question, we've got a bit more information, we've got follow-ups, we can start to really understand who you are as the farmer. And to have this continuous feedback loop that kind of simultaneously supports the farmers, but also supports the entire network. So that's kind of where we're going with things. And this is just kind of looking at how it responds to some of the pain points. Just recognizing with the tech access that we need to, this needs to be available via SMS and WhatsApp. What can we have on Facebook? We've done some testing in Uganda with voice as well. In terms of, you can kind of dial into, say, yes, this is what I'm interested in, yes to this, not to this, and like kind of testing that process using local languages as well. And this kind of, ensuring that we're building this farmer profile is really helping us to strengthen these personalized tips and to kind of identify some lead farmers to support fellow farmers and what they're implementing. And to have this continual farmer feedback and advice that's kind of validated by farmers as well. So this is kind of where things are going, and really looking again to partner with others to figure out how we can share this knowledge, this data and information better and have it really rooted in the realities that farmers are facing. So I think that's everything. Let's see. So back to the beginning, the questions. I'm happy to answer any questions about Croppie or us, but also would love to hear from you all on some of these questions. Yes.
I'm curious to know who pays for what and what's your long-term vision for sustainability?
Yeah. So we're a really small organization. There's about 30 of us working across East Africa, Latin America, here in the States, and then in London and Europe. So our funding is limited, and we are very dependent on grants and funding, and we also limited unrestricted funding. So those in the kind of fundraising donor space, unrestricted money is incredible because it allows you to innovate, to test, to really incorporate kind of feedback from the ground. We've had a lot of bilateral funding, so that can make things a bit more tricky. In terms of kind of civic donors for our work on Croppie specifically, we've had significant funding from GIZ to kind of do our work in Latin America and East Africa. IDB Labs has also funded some of the work that we're doing in Peru. We have been fortunate to have unrestricted donor funding from a few donors in the States, Dovetail, Livelihood Impact Fund. But yeah, this is a big area in terms of how do we actually fund this to make something that works and have sufficient funds to continue to innovate. And yeah.
Have you looked at any models where maybe groups of farmers pay into the system?
We have looked at testing willingness to pay with farmers on our other digital platform, which is the mobile marketplace. Are there incentives at certain points with farmers that have improved their incomes significantly, kind of enough that we could say, would you pay for this service? We haven't yet with Croppie, with the data for decision-making piece. We're looking at kind of strengthened resilience, but the kind of, we have our hypothesis in terms of improved incomes, but it's definitely not super clear. Like with our mobile marketplace platform, we can really clearly see exactly what each farmer is selling. We've got dashboards to see that this is actually, farmers are being paid more than market price. And so we can track a lot of that and feel a bit better about kind of charging. But we're not quite there yet with this. We're looking at different models in terms of with where we're going and kind of sharing data and information, and others that might share their data that might pay kind of for other anonymized data and things like that. But again, in kind of early stages for that.
As a follow-up to that question, do the producers' organizations have an angle on the self-funding piece?
Yeah, so we've found that the producer organizations are in some ways more excited. I got a few more slides actually I can share about the potential of what we're doing than the farmers at times, right? So these are some of the dashboards that we've developed using Tableau, and the data is all kind of from Kobo to share with the producer organization. So these, this is both from one of our coffee partners, Norandino in northern Peru. They have coffee, cocoa, and sugarcane, but that we're able to share from their network of farmers kind of what is the yield, you know, how often are people applying fertilizer, some more data and information about their producers. And this is super helpful for them when they're securing coffee contracts at the start of the season. And so, yes, there is the case that, okay, can we start to charge, or is there kind of a fee from the producer organizations themselves? Yeah.
Thank you. This is really interesting. The first is a bit more of a technical, quick question, but
Yeah.
in terms of taking that picture and predicting yield, maybe you know, maybe this is someone else, but how many coffee shrubs or how much do they need to take to then extrapolate? Or is that kind of quality is based on them? If they take more, they're going to get a better idea of more yield.
It is it's a really set number. I think it's from 9. I'm not sure what the latest is, but the development of the picture taking protocols has been with SIA, and they've kind of refined and refined and refined. And when we did this first in Peru and Colombia and finally got it right, when we then tried to do it in Uganda, it's really different. The coffee trees are not pruned the same way in Uganda. We also went from Arabica to Robusta coffee, and there isn't the same spacing between trees. So things are really, really crowded. So in Peru and Colombia, I think it ended up being like 9 trees, a certain number of branches, this many images. So it's very specific. The first time that we did it, the data quality, which basically was the pictures, were not strong enough for the AI to identify and to see the cherries. And coffee is an annual harvest, right? So you have your one shot each year, and then you have to wait. In saying that, there have been more of these kind of random harvest opportunities because of climate change, where there is coffee cherries kind of blooming at different times. But there is a very set number, and the kind of app can take you through that, or if you're using Kobo, it takes you through the process of taking all the images. But that's how we've learned along the way that you have to put the white background behind so that the AI can better see things. Otherwise, it's just all green. Our team has had opportunities to try to tag the coffee cherries and see if we're any better than the AI. We are not. It is, it's a really exhausting process. It's a lot faster though, taking the photographs than doing the manual counts, which the extension teams would typically go out and do. And at least when we're working in Uganda, there aren't really anybody doing manual counts to go out and see what the yield might be. So we struggled there as well to figure out how to train the algorithm to generate the yield prediction. So we've had many more challenges in Uganda, but it's very specific. Yeah, and it's a lot of pictures, right? Because there's 2,660 farmers involved, and there's 1 million data points, so you can imagine. And there is that question: is it worthwhile to just be these photos and things?
So I have a question in terms, because somebody asked a business question. Have you guys actually looked at also how the European directive, mostly in Africa, is going to take effect in terms of, you know, the deforestation and rules that they have, and maybe using this as an opportunity to actually fund those projects?
Yeah. So this is, I won't get into this too much because we're gonna get out of time, but yes, we just held an event actually in Brussels a few weeks ago with GIZ and some other partners on EUDR, so the European Union's deforestation regulation. And a lot of what we're looking at is how can we start to collect all of these different data points from ourselves, from other partners, and to kind of clean up all this data to have better information that can be shared back with farmers, but also back to kind of EUDR and other opportunities. So this is just kind of showing, this is kind of how all the data is and existing in the ecosystem. It's all over the place. It's unorganized. And, you know, the NGOs are kind of on the outside and might be connected to the farmers, and the companies want this information, and just showing the kind of this ultimate goal of organizing the data and information. So at Producers Direct, we're calling this kind of our shared data layer right now. And just received some funding from Gates to look at how we can incentivize companies specifically and others to share more of their data and information that we can then organize and then share back out with relevant parties. And is there a business case for this? Sharing it back with companies, specific data, but then also how can we fund this so that we can share the information back with farmers themselves for decision making? So it is, yeah, it's kind of embedded in this next phase, kind of Croppie 2.0, if we could get there. Now it looks frozen into this kind of user journey that we're looking at this point.
Because one of the challenges is that there is a new verification group starting to grow.
Yeah.
And my fear is the cost of carrying that verification is going to go back to the farmers, not to the product itself, but to the farmer, which then is going to make the market access even more difficult for them.
Right, yes, and I think a lot of these regulations, the cost ends up ultimately being a burden for the farmer or the producer organization. And so looking at how can we kind of support these processes and look at opportunities from EUDR rather than just all of the unintended consequences from these kind of regulations, for sure.
What is your current timeline for Croppie 2.0, would you say? And are you hoping to have it for other crops, not just coffee?
Yes, so we have looked at the yield prediction side. There is a use case, I think, for banana and then also for cocoa. For other crops, not necessarily that we've seen yet that would work as well. But we are looking at scaling out to other crops, and that is a definite kind of priority area. And also really looking at kind of, you know, this is demonstrated and illustrated that yes, farmers are willing to share data, can play an active role in this and training kind of AI systems and models. And really, what is it that we can do to get more data back into the hands of farmers to kind of incentivize, drive, and empower this decision making? So the Croppie 2.0, yeah, we're you know, early on in that journey, I'd say. We do have a lot of resources in terms of kind of partners that are on board with sharing their data. We've kind of demonstrated that we've got multiple kind of partners that are willing to share, have some funding to look into doing it. And fortunately, we do have a large group of smallholders that are, you know, excited about working with us, or are used to us kind of innovating and trialing and testing new things, as long as they're obviously benefiting from stuff. So it's definitely, you know, a few years out from having that complete journey finalized and finished.
And so with the shift from smartphones to feature phones and WhatsApp, like what adaptations were you forced to incorporate into the new design?
So not that shift was internally was kind of okay because the app took longer to build than during like kind of the first our main challenge honestly with that was our some of our donors and partners that wanted everything to go through the app. And the feedback that we had was that it doesn't actually really make sense. Smartphones aren't really accessible. A priority of the project was empowering women to access this information for decision making, and female farmers don't really have smartphones. So in the first season, things were all really analog, kind of done through just feature phones, done through Kobo, done on paper, and then sharing information back when possible, digitally. Always have a hard time with that word, digitally, but also sharing stuff back through printout forms, right? Okay, this is your yield. These are some of the things that we would recommend. These are what other farmers in your areas are doing. So it was kind of that was working well on one side, and then it was like, okay, can we in some ways layer the app on top of it? And I think the answer there is probably not, it's not needed. It sounds cool and it's a way to maybe secure some funds and get some excitement, but the reality is it doesn't work as well on the ground. So we've kind of gone back to what we know best in terms of how to reach farmers, and are still testing in terms of the tips, what makes most sense, how are the tips best delivered, how are the tips as strong as they can be as well.
I have one more, and you touched on this, but what does the extension support look like longer term in terms of, I think it's that third point, it's not only tech and AI, but who will be those preparing the farmers to use these and continuing to support them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, like most producer organizations and smallholder farmer networks, the extension teams that we're working with are really limited and their resources are really tight, especially around the, if we're looking at coffee specifically, being that one annual harvest and things, it is really tricky to get the support that you'd need from the extension teams. So we work through the producer organizations to identify kind of additional resources, often working through youth agents. So that is obviously kind of funded through us, through donor funds and grants, and it's, subsidized heavily. So how can we make that work long term? And since we've been working in most of these communities for about 15 years, we've also invested heavily in lead farmers and demonstration sites. So a lot of the work is then done through lead farmers that do have access to smartphones, to at least feature phones, that they're then talking to neighbors and peers about how to access these things, how to kind of sign up to this. So that really goes back to that first kind of is deeply rooted in these communities, having a lot of trust with the communities. How you scale out beyond that and further to areas where we haven't worked is another obstacle, another hurdle. But for now, kind of at least in the communities where we have had a presence, we do have really strong networks available on the ground. But again, it's a huge cost to support that. Other questions or thoughts on any of the questions here or experiences that?
I had a question, behavioral change, but
Yeah.
I kind of actually answered that already because you're working with the leaders and the producer organization, but have you incorporated any training in that aspect to really just try to change behavior?
Yes, historically, yes, we've done a lot of work. We initially, if we kind of go back 15 years, our main focus was on doing in-person trainings through promoter farmers and demonstration sites. So invested heavily directly into producer organizations to identify local farmers that were doing some really pioneering, innovative things that we could then invest in building up demonstration sites where farmers would go and kind of see what other farmers were doing and have training materials, printed analog materials to go back. So in terms of behavior change, we've really looked at kind of what happens after training. And that's when kind of our strategy and model evolved. Several years in, we did a big kind of impact evaluation and study and found that post-training, most farmers do nothing, right? And that wasn't just from our work, it was, other work. And why are farmers not doing anything? Either the training didn't resonate, it wasn't delivered in their language, it didn't make sense locally, or they didn't have the funds to invest or acquire the inputs to do it. They couldn't access loans. So then we started to layer on not only training, but we do also give out microloans, microfinancing loans, financing. That's when we started to look at market access, because that was the other thing. Why am I going to invest all of this if I don't have access to markets and then the kind of data for decision making? So we've also gone through a journey in terms of what makes sense and trying to really figure out what will lead to behavior change. Okay, if we invest in training and then we also provide financing after training and then can also provide market access along with kind of data along the way, will that then catalyze behavior change? But it's slow, right? And this is the thing, I think, is that, we can have all these flashy, cool things, but at the end of the day, it's really rooted in farmers changing their behavior. And if we all look at ourselves, we don't change our behavior that much, right? It's a big expectation to kind of lead to the next step. So it's our experience, at least. Anything else? I think we're going to get our Elmo there soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was great.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. I don't have a fancy thing, but you can find us producers direct. Katie Messick is my name.
Fancy.
Yeah, I was like, I don't have the fancy, thing you can scan with your phone.
Thank you.
But anyway, thank you so much.
Thanks, coffee break.
Great.
You worked with
You just made my.
I do, yeah.
I used to work on a Malawi
Yeah,
program. It was kind of connected.
What's the
It was with University of Illinois.
Yeah.